The journey begins. The early morning air was fresh as John watched the sun's first light spill across the horizon, casting a warm glow over his suburban neighborhood. He loaded the last bag into the trunk of their SUV, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. This trip was unlike any other vacation they'd taken as a family. This wasn't just about visiting a new city or exploring somewhere with beaches and amusement parks. No, this was different. They were headed to Charleston, a place of deep history, beauty, and a darker, more painful significance for John's family. Maya, his wife, walked down the driveway with Ella and Carter, their children, both barely able to contain their excitement. To them, this was another grand adventure. Ella, their youngest at 8, was chattering about the fancy houses she'd seen in a travel magazine, while Carter, 11 and curious, was already deep into a book on historic landmarks in Charleston. John chuckled at the contrast between his children. Ella approached every trip as if it were a page from a fairy tale, while Carter, with his insatiable curiosity, had a knack for diving deep into the historical significance of any place they visited. "Everyone ready?" John asked as Maya settled into the passenger seat. She gave him a reassuring smile, one he knew so well. Her strength was quiet but unwavering, the kind of strength he relied on more than he often admitted. They had shared countless late-night talks about this trip, about the importance of heritage, and the responsibility they felt to teach their children about their history. It wasn't an easy decision, but they both agreed it was time. He wanted Ella and Carter to feel proud of who they were, to understand the resilience that flowed through their family story. "Let's do this," Carter yelled from the back seat, fists clenched in excitement. With one last glance at his family, John pulled out of the driveway. The SUV rolled smoothly onto the main road as they left the familiar sights of home behind. The drive was long but enjoyable. Maya played music as they drove through rolling landscapes, filling the car with soft tunes and the occasional hums of his family. As they neared Charleston, the surroundings began to change. The trees grew denser, their branches draped with Spanish moss that swayed gently in the breeze, giving the area an almost mystical feel. Ella pressed her face against the window, captivated by the sight. Even Carter looked up from his book, his mouth slightly agape as he took in the scenery. "Look, Dad, it's like the trees are wearing lace," Ella exclaimed, her voice filled with wonder. John smiled at her description. He hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. The moss hanging from the trees did resemble delicate lace, a contrast to the history rooted here. As they approached the outskirts of Charleston, a wave of emotions washed over John. Charleston was not just any city. It was a place woven into his family's story, a reminder of both the brutal reality of slavery and the resilience of those who had endured it. His grandmother had often told him stories about his ancestors, people who had lived, labored, and survived under unimaginable conditions. She spoke of them with a kind of reverence, instilling in John a sense of pride mixed with a solemn responsibility to carry their memory forward. "Are you okay?" Maya's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, her eyes filled with understanding. John nodded, taking a deep breath. "Just thinking. I want this trip to be meaningful for them. I want them to feel what I felt when Grandma told me those stories." She gave him a soft smile. "They will. You're doing the right thing, John." As they entered the city, the architecture around them shifted to grand, historical buildings and colonial-style homes, each a silent witness to Charleston's complicated past. Their rental house was a modest 2-story building, painted a faded shade of blue with white shutters. It sat nestled near the historic district, a perfect base for the days ahead. Ella and Carter tumbled out of the car the moment it came to a stop, racing each other to the porch. John and Maya exchanged a glance, laughing softly at their children's boundless energy. But as John stepped out of the car, he paused, feeling a weight settle over him. He couldn't shake the sense that this journey would be a turning point for all of them. He knew the stories they would uncover and the emotions they would face. Yet he also knew this was a journey they had to make, not just for him, but for their children and for the generations to come. Inside the house, they were greeted by creaking wooden floors and the faint scent of lavender from a small vase in the entryway. The walls were decorated with framed black and white photographs of Charleston's waterfront, and the furniture had a worn charm that felt inviting. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect for them. A place with history, character, and a sense of timelessness. Once they'd settled in, John gathered his family in the cozy living room. He held a worn, leather-bound journal, an heirloom passed down through his family. His grandmother had entrusted it to him years ago, each page filled with stories, notes, and memories of their ancestors. The journal was a tangible link to his family's past, a reminder of the hardships they had endured and the strength they had shown. "Before we start exploring, I want to show you something," John said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence as he opened the journal. Ella and Carter leaned in, their eyes wide with curiosity. "This is our family's history," John began, tracing his fingers over the faded ink. "Your great-great-grandfather was born not far from here. He wasn't free. He worked these lands not by choice but because he was forced to. But he survived, and he left behind a legacy that brought us to where we are today." Carter's eyes sparkled with interest, and Ella's serious face showed she was absorbing every word. They might not fully understand the weight of the story yet, but John could see that they sensed its importance. Maya placed a hand on John's shoulder, grounding him with her presence. "Your dad is right," she added. "This trip isn't just about learning history. It's about understanding the strength of our ancestors, who faced hardships we can hardly imagine. That strength runs in our veins." The afternoon faded into evening as they read aloud from the journal, sharing stories of courage, loss, and hope. Carter and Ella listened intently, the words connecting them to their past, turning history into something alive, something they could feel within themselves. When it was time for bed, John found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, his heart full. Tomorrow, they would begin exploring the city, visiting the places that held pieces of his family's story. He hoped that through this journey, his children would come to understand not only the weight of their heritage, but also the strength that came with it. The following morning, as the sun rose over Charleston's historic streets, John felt the excitement of the day building within him. It was more than just a visit. It was a pilgrimage, a tribute to those who had come before them. His journey as a father was intertwined with this trip, and he was determined to share the legacy of resilience, courage, and dignity with his children. They were about to embark on a journey through time, a journey that would shape not only their understanding of history, but also their understanding of themselves. The weight of heritage. The next morning was bathed in a warm, golden glow as the family prepared for their first day of exploration in Charleston. John was up before everyone else, sitting on the small wooden porch, sipping coffee as the streets slowly came to life around him. The air was filled with the sounds of early morning activity, the rumble of delivery trucks, the soft chatter of people greeting each other, and the gentle clinking of coffee cups from a nearby cafe. Charleston was awake, and with each passing moment, John could feel the city's deep history pulling him in. Today was the day he would share his family's story with Carter and Ella, not as something abstract or hidden within the pages of a journal, but as something tangible, woven into the very streets, buildings, and fields they would visit. He wanted them to feel connected to the lives that had come before them, to the strength and resilience of ancestors who had endured the darkest of times. Maya joined him on the porch, handing him a second cup of coffee. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly, her eyes reflecting both understanding and concern. He took a deep breath, unsure how to answer. "I think I'm ready, but I don't know how much the kids will understand. How you teach children about something so painful and yet so important. They'll understand more than you think," she said, squeezing his hand reassuringly. "They look up to you, John. You'll help them see not only the pain but also the strength in their heritage." He gave her a grateful nod, feeling the familiar comfort of her presence beside him. Just then, the front door swung open, and Ella and Carter appeared, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, but eager to start the day. "Are we going to see the big houses today, Dad?" Ella asked, her voice brimming with excitement. "Yeah, Dad. Are we going to see any cool historic stuff?" Carter added, clearly just as excited, though his tone was more serious. John chuckled. "Yes, we'll see plenty of big houses and lots of historic things. But first, there's a place I want us all to visit. It's an important part of our family story." After breakfast, they set out on foot, heading toward the heart of Charleston's historic district. The streets were lined with pastel-colored homes with wrought iron balconies, cobblestone paths, and grand oak trees draped in moss. The architecture was stunning, each building standing as a testament to the city's complex past. Yet John couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness as they walked, knowing that the beauty of this city was built on the backs of people who had been denied their freedom, including his own ancestors. They arrived at their first stop of the day, a small museum dedicated to Charleston's history, located in a beautifully preserved colonial building. The museum's interior was cool and quiet, the air heavy with the weight of stories untold. Carter and Ella walked close to their parents, glancing around with wide eyes as they took in the exhibits. The museum was laid out chronologically, each room representing a different period in Charleston's history. The first room was filled with artifacts from the indigenous tribes who originally inhabited the land, pottery, tools, and drawings that captured a way of life long gone. John paused, gathering his children's attention. "This land didn't always belong to Charleston settlers," he explained, pointing to the exhibits. "Before anyone else came, the indigenous people were here, living, thriving, and building a society of their own." Carter looked at the display thoughtfully. "So, they were here first. And then, what happened to them?" John nodded, his voice soft. "They were forced off their land, just like so many other people were forced into hard situations. It's a sad part of history, but it's important for us to understand." They moved into the next room, which covered the colonial period, a time when Charleston was growing into one of the most prosperous cities in America. But the wealth that Charleston boasted came at a steep cost. The room was filled with documents, maps, and artifacts that depicted the city's booming economy. But as John led his family deeper into the exhibit, he felt the familiar weight settle over him. This was where his family's story began, a story tied to the brutal institution of slavery that had once fueled Charleston's prosperity. They finally entered a dimly lit room dedicated to the memory of those who had been enslaved. It was a haunting space, filled with iron shackles, auction records, and the remnants of people's lives reduced to numbers and labels. Shadows danced along the walls, giving the room a somber, almost sacred feel. Ella reached for John's hand, her grip tight as she took in the displays, her young mind grappling with the reality of what she was seeing. "Did our family go through this, Dad?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. John took a steadying breath, kneeling down so he could look into her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. Our ancestors were here too. They didn't have a choice, but they survived. They were strong, and that strength is part of us too." He looked up at Carter, who was standing quietly, his face reflecting a mix of emotions, confusion, sadness, and a simmering anger that John recognized all too well. "It's not fair," Carter muttered, clenching his fists. "Why did they have to go through that?" John placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "It wasn't fair, Carter. But they held on. They fought in their own ways, through their strength and resilience. And because of them, we're here today. It's our job to remember them and to honor their strength." Maya, standing beside them, added softly, "They may have endured hardships, but they also kept hope alive. They passed down stories, traditions, and love. That's how they survived, and that's why we're here, to carry those stories forward." The family stood in silence for a moment, each of them processing the weight of the stories they had just learned. John felt a mixture of pride and sorrow as he watched his children grapple with the realities of their heritage. He knew it wasn't easy for them to understand, but he could see that they were beginning to grasp the importance of their history, a history that was both painful and empowering. They continued through the museum, eventually reaching an exhibit on the civil rights movement. The walls were adorned with photographs of marches, protests, and people holding signs demanding justice and equality. John felt a surge of pride as he looked at the images, knowing that his ancestors' strength had paved the way for these moments of defiance and courage. Carter and Ella were captivated, their eyes drawn to the faces of the people in the photographs. People who had stood up against injustice, who had risked everything for a chance at freedom and dignity. John turned to his children, his voice filled with conviction. These people fought for the rights we have today. They carried forward the strength of our ancestors, turning it into action. Every step they took, every protest, every march, it was because they believed in a future where we could live with dignity. Ella looked up at him, her eyes wide. So, we're like them, too. We're part of this. John nodded, a smile breaking through his somber expression. Yes, honey. We're part of this story. And one day, you'll tell your own children about it, so they'll know where they come from and the strength they carry within them. By the time they left the museum, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across Charleston's historic streets. John felt the weight of the day settling over him, but it was a good weight, one that filled him with a sense of purpose. He had shared a part of himself with his children, given them a glimpse into the history that shaped them. He knew there would be more questions, more conversations in the days to come, but he was ready. The family spent the rest of the day wandering through Charleston's historic district. They marveled at the grand mansions, the pastel-painted houses, and the lush gardens that seemed to spill out onto the cobblestone streets. Yet, beneath the charm of Charleston's architecture, John could still feel the echoes of the past, as if the city itself carried the stories of those who had lived, suffered, and persevered here. As they walked, John couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude for his ancestors. Their lives had been filled with unimaginable hardships, yet they had managed to hold on to their humanity, their dignity, and their hope. And now, standing here with his family, John felt that connection more strongly than ever. He was their descendant, a testament to their strength, and he was determined to pass that strength on to his children. By the time they returned to their rental house, the day was fading into a soft evening glow. They gathered in the living room, exhausted but fulfilled, each of them carrying the weight of the day's experiences in their own way. John watched his children, their faces reflecting a newfound sense of understanding and pride. They had glimpsed the strength of their ancestors, and he knew that this knowledge would stay with them, shaping them in ways they couldn't yet understand. As they prepared for bed, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had taken the first steps of their journey together, a journey that would continue for the rest of their lives. They were more than just a family. They were a living testament to the strength, resilience, and hope passed down through generations. And as John lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he made a silent promise to his ancestors. He would carry their stories forward, share their strength with his children, and ensure that their legacy would never be forgotten. Echoes of the past. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over Charleston's cobblestone streets, as John led his family through the city toward one of their most anticipated destinations, the former plantation where his ancestors had once labored. It was a place he had read about countless times in family journals and history books, but today he would be walking on the same land, feeling the same soil beneath his feet. He wasn't sure what to expect or how his family would react, but he felt it was essential for them to understand the reality of their family's journey. They walked in relative silence, the weight of the day's purpose settling heavily over them. Maya walked close to John, her presence a quiet support as they approached the long, tree-lined driveway leading up to the plantation grounds. The towering oaks cast intricate shadows across the path, their branches draped with Spanish moss that swayed gently in the breeze. The sight was both beautiful and haunting, a living reminder of the plantation's dual legacy, its grandeur and its pain. Carter and Ella walked a few steps ahead, their faces a mixture of curiosity and reverence. John could see the subtle shift in their demeanor as they approached the plantation. Gone was their typical excitement and chatter. Instead, they seemed to sense the gravity of the place they were about to enter. They had spent hours yesterday learning about their ancestors, and now they would be stepping onto the very ground where those ancestors had once toiled. At the entrance to the plantation, a tour guide greeted them with a warm smile, handing out pamphlets that detailed the plantation's history. She was a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and a kind face, but as John glanced at the pamphlet, he felt a pang of discomfort. The brochure was filled with photos of the beautiful house, gardens, and grounds, the language describing a legacy of prosperity and elegance. The darker parts of that legacy, the forced labor and suffering that had made that prosperity possible, were barely mentioned. John folded the pamphlet and slipped it into his pocket, exchanging a look with Maya. She gave him a small, understanding nod, her eyes reflecting the same discomfort. They both knew that this was part of what they had to face. History, as often told in places like this, was sanitized, made palatable for tourists. Its harsh realities softened or omitted entirely. But they were here to honor the truth, even if it wasn't the version printed in brochures. The tour began at the Grand House, a sprawling mansion with towering white columns and wide porches that overlooked the manicured gardens. The guide spoke with enthusiasm about the architecture, the family who had built the estate, and the wealth that had allowed them to live in such luxury. Her tone was light, almost celebratory, as she described the grand parties that had been held here, the distinguished guests who had once walked these halls. John felt a tightening in his chest as he listened. To him, the house wasn't just a symbol of wealth or elegance. It was a monument to oppression, a reminder of the lives that had been spent and discarded to maintain that luxury. He noticed Carter clenching his fists, his expression tense as he listened. John placed a hand on his son's shoulder, grounding him, silently reminding him that there was more to learn, more to understand. The tour continued through the main house, where rooms were filled with antique furniture, portraits, and artifacts from the plantation's past. But John found himself growing increasingly detached from the guide's narrative. He glanced at his family, catching Maya's eye, and knew they felt the same. The true story wasn't here in these rooms or in the carefully curated displays. It was outside, in the fields, in the quarters where the enslaved people had once lived. That's where they needed to go. As the tour group moved toward the back of the house, the guide paused near a smaller building, the old slave quarters. Her voice softened as she acknowledged the more difficult aspects of the plantation's history, but her words were vague, her tone almost dismissive. She mentioned difficult times and the challenges faced by all, reducing the brutal reality of slavery to a few sanitized phrases. John felt a surge of frustration but forced himself to stay calm. He knew that, for many, this was an uncomfortable truth, one they preferred to keep at a distance. But for him, for his family, this was personal. He turned to his children, lowering his voice as he spoke. "This is where our ancestors lived," he said quietly, gesturing to the row of small weathered cabins. "They didn't choose to be here. They were forced to work these fields, to build these walls, to serve in that house. But they held on to hope. They found ways to survive, to keep their families together." Ella's face reflected a mixture of sadness and confusion. "But Dad, why? Why did they have to live like that?" John sighed, feeling the weight of her question. "Because back then, people saw them as less than human. They were treated as property, bought and sold, forced to work without pay, without freedom. It wasn't right, and it wasn't fair, but they held on, even in those terrible conditions, because they believed in something greater. They believed in the future, in us." They walked slowly toward the slave quarters, taking in the sight of the cramped, dilapidated cabins where families had once lived. Each cabin was no bigger than a small room, with wooden walls cracked from age and windows so tiny they barely let in any light. The guide had moved on, leading the rest of the group back toward the gardens, but John and his family lingered by the cabins. Carter was silent, his face set in a determined frown. He ran his fingers over the weathered wood, tracing the grooves with a somber reverence. So they lived here, and worked every day, in the fields and the house. John nodded, his voice quiet. Every day, they didn't have a choice, but they found ways to stay strong, to hold on to their humanity. They sang songs, told stories, and passed down their traditions. Even when everything was taken from them, they held on to the things that mattered most: their families, their beliefs, their hope for a better future. As they stood in silence, a small plaque near one of the cabins caught John's eye. It was a dedication to the enslaved people who had lived and labored on the plantation, listing only a handful of names, most incomplete, some just numbers. Lives reduced to fragments, memories barely preserved. Maya placed a gentle hand on the plaque, her eyes filled with sadness. She closed her eyes for a moment, murmuring a quiet prayer, honoring those who had lived here. John watched her, feeling the surge of pride and gratitude for his wife's quiet strength, her unwavering respect for the ancestors whose memory she held close. Ella tugged on his sleeve, her young face solemn. "Dad, why don't they have last names? Why are some of them just numbers?" John swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. Because, to the people who owned them, they weren't seen as people. They were treated as property, like things, not as individuals with names and families. It's painful to think about, but it's the truth. And that's why we're here, to remember them, to honor them, and to make sure their stories aren't forgotten. Ella's eyes filled with tears as she leaned into her mother's embrace, struggling to process the harsh reality of her family's past. John felt a pang of sorrow as he watched his daughter grapple with a truth he wished he could protect her from. But he knew that understanding their heritage, even the painful parts, was essential. They couldn't move forward without acknowledging where they came from. After a while, they moved to the edge of the plantation's vast fields, where rows of crops stretched out toward the horizon. The guide had rejoined them, speaking now about the plantation's role in growing crops like rice, cotton, and indigo. But John barely listened. His mind was on his ancestors, imagining them working under the hot sun, their hands calloused and worn from years of labor. He could almost hear their voices, feel their strength and determination as they toiled day after day, finding ways to endure, to survive, to hold on to hope. Carter looked out over the fields, his young face reflecting a quiet anger. "They didn't deserve this," he said, his voice tight. "None of them did." John placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "No, they didn't, but they didn't give up. They held on, even when everything was against them. And because of their strength, we're here today." They lingered by the fields, each of them lost in their thoughts, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on them. The guide led the group back toward the main house, but John and his family stayed behind, saying their own silent goodbyes to the land and to the memories it held. On the walk back to the rental house, the family was quiet, each of them processing the day in their own way. The streets of Charleston bustled with activity, the vibrant life of the city contrasting sharply with the somber memories of the plantation. Yet, John felt a sense of peace settling over him. They had come here to honor their family's legacy, to remember the strength and resilience that had brought them through. And in doing so, they had connected with something deep, something powerful that would stay with them forever. That evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, the family shared a quiet meal. There were no lively conversations, no recounting of the day's highlights, only a shared sense of understanding and reverence. Ella and Carter were subdued, their young minds grappling with the reality of their heritage, but John could see a newfound sense of pride in their eyes, a pride rooted not in the accomplishments of others, but in the resilience of their ancestors. As they said goodnight, John held his children a little longer, his heart filled with love and pride. He knew this trip would be one they would carry with them for the rest of their lives, a memory etched into their hearts, shaping their understanding of who they were and where they came from. And as he lay in bed that night, John felt a sense of fulfillment, a quiet satisfaction that they had honored their ancestors not by looking away from the pain, but by facing it head-on, by acknowledging the lives that had come before them with respect and reverence. They had journeyed through their family's history, felt the weight of the past, and emerged stronger, bound by a legacy of courage and resilience. And as John drifted off to sleep, he knew that this journey was far from over. They would carry these memories forward, honoring their ancestors not just in words, but in the lives they lived, a testament to the strength and dignity that had been passed down through generations. An uneasy encounter. The morning after their visit to the plantation, John awoke with a strange mixture of peace and tension in his heart. The memories of their experience lingered, etched into his mind. But there was also a growing unease, a sense that something more lay ahead. He had come to Charleston with the hope of connecting his family to their roots, of paying homage to the resilience of his ancestors. Yet he knew that uncovering the past wasn't only about pride and understanding. It could also expose them to the realities of prejudice that still lingered in the present. As they walked through the historic district later that day, John found himself noticing the subtle glances from people they passed on the street. Charleston was a beautiful city, but it wasn't immune to the unspoken biases that often accompanied visitors like them. Black families moving through spaces where they hadn't always been welcomed. He felt Maya's hand slip into his as if sensing his thoughts, her presence a quiet reassurance. Their destination that morning was the old city square, a bustling area where vendors sold handmade crafts and musicians filled the air with smooth jazz. The square was alive with color and energy, and the children seemed to pick up on the mood, their spirits brightening as they explored the rows of tables filled with art, jewelry, and trinkets. They wandered toward the square's center, where a large statue stood, a bronze figure of a man with a solemn gaze, his hand resting on his chest as he looked out over the city. John recognized the statue. It was a historical figure lauded for his influence in Charleston's past, a man celebrated for his achievements. But John knew the fuller history, a man who had also profited from slavery and exploitation, his legacy a testament to the city's complex and painful history. As he stood by the statue, lost in thought, he noticed a small group of people nearby. They were murmuring quietly among themselves, their gazes shifting back and forth from the statue to John and his family. He tried to ignore it, brushing it off as curiosity, but the glances lingered, and he felt the familiar prickling on the back of his neck. Maya, who had also noticed, gave him a reassuring nod, silently encouraging him to let it go. But the quiet judgment in the stranger's eyes left a lingering bitterness that was hard to shake. This wasn't the first time they'd experienced such stares. It was an unfortunate part of life, an experience that echoed through the generations. Still, it hurt, especially here, in a place that was supposed to hold special meaning for them. "Are they looking at us, Dad?" Ella asked quietly, her voice laced with confusion. John forced a calm smile, kneeling down to meet her gaze. "Yes, sweetheart, they might be. But sometimes people just don't understand things that are different from what they're used to. We don't let it bother us because we know who we are, right?" She nodded slowly, but John could see the hurt in her eyes, the way she clung a little tighter to his hand. He wanted to shield her from these moments, but he knew he couldn't protect her forever. They had come here to learn about their family's history, to connect with their roots, but he hadn't anticipated how even their presence in these spaces could stir up discomfort in others. Just then, one of the people from the group, a middle-aged woman with a sharp, probing gaze, approached them. She stopped a few feet away, looking them over with an expression that was difficult to read. "Excuse me," she began, her voice clipped, "but I couldn't help but notice your family spending a lot of time around here. Are you from Charleston?" The question was simple enough, but the tone carried a subtle undercurrent that didn't go unnoticed by John or Maya. He straightened, forcing a polite smile. "We're just visiting," he replied calmly, his voice even. "Taking in the sights, learning more about the history." The woman pursed her lips, her gaze drifting from John to his children, and back again. "I see," she said slowly. "I guess I just don't usually see families like yours around here." Her voice softened, but the words carried a quiet implication that stung. John felt a surge of frustration, but managed to keep his expression neutral. He'd encountered this type of microaggression before, the quiet questioning of his family's presence, the unspoken suggestion that they didn't belong. In Charleston, of all places, a city built, in no small part, on the backs of people who looked like him. Maya stepped forward, her voice gentle yet firm. "We're here to connect with our family's history, to honor our roots," she said, meeting the woman's gaze with a quiet strength. "We have every right to be here." The woman looked taken aback, her expression faltering for a moment before she quickly composed herself. "Of course," she replied, offering a forced smile before stepping back. "Enjoy your visit." John felt a wave of relief as she walked away, but his frustration lingered. The encounter had left an uncomfortable wave on his heart. As they continued through the square, he tried to focus on his children, hoping they wouldn't dwell on the incident. He wanted to keep the day light, to let them enjoy the city without the burden of others' judgments. They wandered from vendor to vendor, admiring the handmade crafts and the vibrant artwork on display. Carter found a stall selling old books and immediately gravitated toward it, flipping through the worn pages with a look of wonder. Ella was drawn to a jewelry stall, her eyes lighting up as she admired the delicate bracelets and necklaces on display. John smiled, watching his children's excitement. For a moment, the tension from the earlier encounter faded, replaced by a sense of contentment. He wrapped an arm around Maya's shoulders, giving her a grateful smile. They were here, together, honoring their heritage and creating new memories. That was what mattered. Just as he was beginning to relax, John's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen to see a local news notification. Curiously, he opened the alert, and his heart sank as he read the headline. "Police respond to suspicious activity report at local historic site." Beneath the headline was a brief description of the report. It mentioned a family matching the description of out-of-town visitors, their actions deemed suspicious by locals. As he read further, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The description matched them perfectly. Maya noticed his expression and leaned over to look at the phone, her face paling as she took in the words. "Is that about us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, feeling a cold wave of disbelief wash over him. Someone had reported them, simply for existing in a space where they didn't fit in the eyes of others. It was infuriating, a harsh reminder of the bias that still lingered in places like this. He forced a calm expression for the children's sake, though his mind raced with worry. He knew the importance of staying calm, of not letting his anger or fear show. But the fact that they could be seen as suspicious, simply for being a black family exploring their heritage, was a bitter pill to swallow. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Carter asked, noticing the tension in his father's face. John forced a reassuring smile, though his heart pounded in his chest. "Yes, everything's fine, son. We might just have to answer a few questions if we're approached, but we haven't done anything wrong. Just remember that, okay?" Carter and Ella nodded, though John could see the unease in their eyes. He hated that they had to experience this, that he had to explain why they might be questioned for doing nothing more than enjoying a family outing. But he knew that this was part of the reality they faced, a lesson he couldn't shield them from forever. Within minutes, John spotted 2 police officers entering the square, their eyes scanning the crowd with determined expressions. His stomach tightened as he recognized the lead officer, a tall man with a stern, unyielding gaze that seemed to cut through the crowd. The officers made their way toward John's family, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "Good afternoon, officers," John greeted them politely, keeping his tone calm. Is there something we can help you with? The lead officer, whose name tag read Parker, looked at John with a scrutinizing expression. We receive reports of suspicious behavior here in the square, he began, his tone measured but firm. Some locals seemed concerned by your presence. John's jaw tightened, though he maintained his calm. We're just here visiting, learning about the history, like any other family. Parker raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting briefly to Maya and the children. And where are you from, sir? He asked, his tone carrying a quiet challenge. We're visiting from out of town, John replied evenly, just here to see the sights. The second officer, standing slightly behind Parker, shifted uncomfortably. He seemed younger, less certain, and cast a quick glance at John before speaking up. It's probably just a misunderstanding, he murmured, his voice low but audible. They're not causing any trouble. Parker shot him a warning glance but continued, his tone laced with quiet authority. Do you have identification, sir? John felt his frustration building, but forced himself to remain calm. He reached into his pocket, carefully retrieving his ID, and handed it over. Maya did the same, her face a picture of quiet resolve. They both knew the importance of staying composed, of not giving the officers any reason to escalate the situation. As Parker inspected the IDs with exaggerated slowness, John could feel his children's eyes on him, their confusion and fear mingling with a silent plea for reassurance. He glanced at them, giving a slight nod, a reminder that they were doing nothing wrong. After what felt like an eternity, Parker handed the IDs back with a curt nod. Thank you, he said, though his tone was anything but gracious, just making sure everything checks out. John took back the IDs, resisting the urge to say something he might regret. Instead, he nodded politely, thankful to be done with the encounter. As they turned to leave, Carter tugged on his father's sleeve, his voice filled with confusion. Dad, why did they stop us? We weren't doing anything wrong. John knelt down, his voice steady as he looked into his son's eyes. Sometimes people don't see us for who we are. They see what they want to see, and that can make them act unfairly. But remember, we know who we are, and we don't need anyone else's approval for that. Ella moved closer, clutching his arm as she whispered, But we're just a family. John felt a pang in his heart, but he kept his expression calm, his voice gentle. Yes, honey, and no one else's opinions can change that. As they left the square, John felt the weight of the day pressing down on him, the silent reminder of the world his children would have to navigate. But he knew that, together, they would face it with dignity, resilience, and pride. They had come to Charleston to honor their heritage, and he was determined that no one's prejudice would take that away from them. This journey was about more than remembering the past. It was about forging a path forward, a path that would carry their family's strength and resilience into the future. And as they walked away from the square, John felt a quiet resolve settle within him. They were here, together, bound by a legacy that no prejudice could diminish. Confronting the present, the family walked away from the square in silence, each of them weighed down by the reality of the encounter they had just experienced. For John, the bitterness of the moment lingered, mingling with a quiet anger he struggled to suppress. Maya's hand slipped into his as they moved down the narrow cobblestone streets, her grip firm and steady, a silent reminder that they were in this together. He could see the questions in his children's eyes, the confusion, the hurt, the unspoken why that hung between them. They had come to Charleston to connect with the past, but today the weight of the present had forced its way into their journey. John couldn't ignore the irony of it. They had come here to remember, to honor their ancestors' resilience, only to be met with the kind of subtle prejudice that still haunted spaces like these. Dad, Carter's voice broke the silence, his tone tentative. I still don't get it. We weren't doing anything wrong. Why did they have to check our IDs? John slowed his pace, placing a comforting hand on Carter's shoulder. He looked into his son's eyes, struggling to find the right words, Words that would help Carter understand but not leave him feeling burdened by the weight of that understanding. Sometimes, John began carefully, people make judgments based on things they don't understand, things that might be different from what they're used to. And that can make them afraid, even when there's no real reason to be. Carter frowned, his brows knitting together. But that's not fair. We weren't hurting anybody. John nodded, his heart heavy. You're right, Carter. It isn't fair, but that's why it's so important that we know who we are and stand tall, even when others don't see us the way we see ourselves. Ella looked up, her small hand clinging to John's as she whispered, "Does this happen a lot, Dad?" John exchanged a quick glance with Maya, who gave him a soft nod of encouragement. He took a deep breath, kneeling down so he could look Ella in the eyes. "Sometimes it does, honey. But it's not something we let control us. There will always be people who don't understand, who might even judge us without knowing us. But that doesn't change who we are. We carry our pride, our strength, with us, and no one else's opinions can take that away." Ella nodded slowly, though he could see the sadness in her eyes. John felt his heart ache, but he knew that these moments, painful as they were also necessary. His children would grow up in a world that wasn't always fair, and he wanted them to be prepared, to face challenges with dignity and courage, just as their ancestors had. As they continued down the street, the conversation faded, replaced by the sounds of the city around them, the distant hum of traffic, the laughter of children playing, the gentle murmur of conversations drifting from nearby cafes. Charleston was alive, its beauty undeniable, but today, John couldn't help but feel the undercurrents of tension that lay beneath its charm. They eventually found themselves near one of Charleston's older public squares, a quieter spot away from the bustling crowds, where large oak trees provided ample shade, and a fountain gurgled softly at the center. John suggested they take a break, hoping the peaceful setting might ease some of the tension from the day. They settled on a bench under one of the sprawling oaks, its branches casting dappled shadows over them as they took in the serene atmosphere. After a few minutes, Maya turned to John, her voice quiet but steady. "This trip, it's about more than just the past, isn't it?" John nodded, understanding what she meant. "It is. I thought we were just coming here to remember, to teach Carter and Ella about where they come from. But being here, it feels like we're confronting something more. The past isn't just a memory, it's something we still carry with us, and sometimes the present has a way of reminding us just how close it really is." Maya reached over, placing a hand over his. "And you're right to teach them that, to show them that they're part of something bigger, something powerful. Today wasn't easy, but it's a lesson they'll remember, a reminder of the strength they carry." John looked at his children, who were watching them quietly, and felt a sense of resolve settle within him. This was part of their journey, part of understanding not only who they were but also the world they lived in, a world that wasn't always kind but one they could navigate with pride and resilience. As they sat in the shade, John felt a stirring of purpose. He had spent so much of his life trying to shield his children from the harsher realities of the world, hoping they wouldn't have to experience the prejudices he'd faced. But now he understood that sheltering them wasn't the answer. Instead, he needed to show them how to stand tall in the face of ignorance, to carry their heritage with pride, and to face challenges with grace and strength. "Tomorrow," John began, glancing at his family, "there's a place I'd like to take you all. It's not on the typical tourist path, but it's important. It's a memorial dedicated to the enslaved people who were brought to Charleston, a place where we can remember them, honor their lives." Carter's eyes lit up, a spark of curiosity returning to his face. "I'd like that, Dad. I want to see it." Ella nodded, her expression somber but determined. "Me too." Maya smiled, a look of quiet pride in her eyes. "Then it's settled. Tomorrow, we go." The decision brought a sense of peace to John's heart, a feeling of purpose that helped lift the weight of the day. He had come to Charleston to connect with his family's past, but now he saw that this journey was about more than just remembering. It was about confronting the present, about understanding that their heritage was not something locked away in history books. It was alive, part of who they were, and something that would guide them forward. As the sun began to set, casting the square in a warm golden light, they stood up, ready to head back to their rental house. The walk back was peaceful, and John felt the day's tension begin to ease. Tomorrow, they would honor the lives of those who had come before them, and in doing so, they would find a way to carry their legacy forward, unbroken and undiminished. That night, as they gathered around the dinner table, they spoke quietly of their plans, of the memorial they would visit, and of the strength of the ancestors who had endured so much. John watched his children as they listened, their faces reflecting both a newfound understanding and a sense of pride. He knew that today had been difficult, but he also knew that it was a lesson they needed, a reminder that their journey was about more than just learning history. It was about embracing their heritage with pride, even in the face of adversity. After dinner, they lingered in the living room, sharing stories from John's family journal, each entry a small piece of the legacy they were here to honor. By the time they finally retired to bed, John felt a sense of quiet fulfillment, a reassurance that their journey was taking them exactly where they needed to go. And as he lay beside Maya, her hand in his, he made a silent promise to himself, to his family, and to his ancestors. They would honor this journey, this legacy, and carry it forward with pride. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, strengthened by the lives that had come before them and the love that bound them now. The legacy of strength. The following morning was overcast, the sky a canvas of soft grays that seemed to match the solemnity of the day's purpose. John felt a quiet resolve as he gathered his family, explaining their plan to visit the memorial dedicated to the enslaved people brought to Charleston centuries ago. Today was the culmination of their journey, a final step in honoring the legacy of resilience they had come here to uncover. As they walked through the streets toward the memorial, John felt the familiar weight of the past settling over him, mingling with a quiet pride. Maya walked beside him, her expression focused and steady, while Carter and Ella, though quieter than usual, carried themselves with a sense of reverence. It had been a challenging journey, filled with unexpected moments and harsh lessons, but John felt a sense of satisfaction in knowing that they were growing stronger, more connected with each step. They reached the memorial site just as the city began to stir to life around them. The memorial was tucked away from the main roads, its design simple yet profound. It consisted of a series of granite walls arranged in a semicircle, each engraved with names, stories, and memories of the countless lives that had been uprooted, transported, and enslaved. As they stepped closer, John noticed plaques set into the ground, each one bearing a line of poetry or a brief history of the people who had endured this place. The quiet of the memorial enveloped them, its stillness inviting them to reflect, to listen to the echoes of the past. For John, this was a sacred space, a place where the resilience of his ancestors was honored, their sacrifices and survival remembered. He hoped it would be a place of healing for his family, a space where they could lay down some of the burdens they'd carried over the past few days and replace them with a renewed sense of purpose. They stood in silence, taking in the names etched into the stone. Some names were accompanied by brief descriptions, a place of origin, a date, a family relationship. Others were simply names, alone and isolated, stark reminders of the countless lives whose stories have been erased, reduced to fragments. Carter broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. So, these are our ancestors, people like them. John nodded, his eyes misty. Yes, Carter. People who went through things we can hardly imagine. They were forced to leave everything they knew behind, brought here in terrible conditions, made to work without freedom. But despite everything, they found ways to survive. They didn't give up. Ella looked up at him, her face reflecting a mixture of sorrow and pride. But we don't know all their names. John swallowed, feeling the weight of her question. No, sweetheart, Many of their names were lost because they weren't treated as people with identities and stories. They were seen as property, but just because their names were lost doesn't mean they're forgotten. They live on through us, through our memories, and by honoring them, we're making sure that their strength isn't forgotten. They moved slowly along the memorial, each taking their time to read the inscriptions, to feel the weight of the lives that had come before them. John noticed Carter running his fingers over the names, his face a mixture of anger and pride. He understood the pain his son was feeling, the frustration of knowing that their family's history was intertwined with a legacy of suffering. But he also knew that this knowledge would make his son stronger, that it would teach him to carry his heritage with dignity. They stopped at a small plaque set near the back of the memorial, engraved with a simple, powerful quote: "We are the inheritors of a difficult history, but it is in remembering that we find our strength." The words resonated deeply, and John felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He turned to his children, his voice filled with conviction. "This is what it means to carry our heritage," he said softly. "It's not just about remembering the pain or the hardships. It's about remembering the strength, the courage, the love that held them together even when the world was against them. That's what we carry with us. That's what makes us strong." Ella took his hand, her eyes reflecting a newfound understanding. "So, we're like them. We have that same strength." John nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, Ella, that strength is in us, in you. And one day, you'll pass it on to your children, just like we're passing it on to you. It's a legacy that can't be taken away." They stood together in silence, feeling the presence of those who had come before them, the quiet strength that lingered in the air around them. John felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for his ancestors, for the resilience that had carried them through the darkest of times and made it possible for him to stand here with his family today. He closed his eyes, saying a silent prayer of thanks, a promise that he would carry this legacy forward, honor it, and ensure that it was never forgotten. Maya stepped closer to him, slipping her hand into his. She looked at him with a gentle smile, her eyes reflecting the same gratitude he felt. "Thank you, John," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for bringing us here, for sharing this with us." He nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I needed to do this, for all of us, so that we'd know where we come from, the strength that's in us, so that when the world challenges us, we'll remember that we're never alone." As they left the memorial, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. This trip had been about more than just remembering the past. It had been about understanding their place in it, their role as carriers of a legacy that stretched back through generations. The challenges they'd faced, the prejudices they'd encountered, those were reminders that the fight for dignity and respect was far from over. But now, he felt ready to face those challenges with his family, to carry their heritage forward with pride. The walk back through Charleston was quiet but peaceful. The city seemed different now, its historic streets and buildings no longer just relics of the past, but living reminders of the resilience that had brought them here. John looked at his children, seeing the change in their faces, the way they held themselves with a quiet dignity that hadn't been there before. When they returned to their rental house, the family gathered in the living room, sharing a quiet meal and talking about the day. Ella and Carter asked questions, their curiosity endless, and John answered each one with patience, weaving together the history they had learned with the values he wanted to instill in them: strength, resilience, and a commitment to honoring the lives of those who had come before them. As the evening drew on, John felt a sense of closure settling over him. He knew that this journey was just the beginning for his children, that they would carry these memories forward, shaping their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. But he also knew that he had given them something precious, a connection to their heritage, a pride that no one could take away. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, John and Maya sat together on the porch, listening to the quiet sounds of the Charleston night. The air was cool, filled with the scent of the sea and the distant hum of city life. John took Maya's hand, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for this journey, for the family they have built, and for the legacy they carry together. "You did something important today, John," Maya said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "You gave them something they'll carry for the rest of their lives." He nodded, his heart full. "They're ready now. Ready to face the world, to stand tall even when things get tough. We gave them that strength, and I know they'll carry it forward." As they sat in silence, John felt a profound sense of peace. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, that there would be moments of challenge and pain. But he also knew that his family was strong, bound by a legacy that stretched back through time, a legacy that no prejudice or ignorance could erase. And as he looked out over the city, the historic buildings illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights, John felt a quiet resolve settle within him. They were part of something larger, something that would carry them forward, unbroken and unbowed. The strength of his ancestors was in them, guiding them, and he knew that they would face the future with pride, courage, and an unshakable sense of purpose. In that moment, John made a promise to himself and to the generations that would follow. He would honor this legacy, carry it forward, and ensure that the strength of his family, his ancestors, and their stories would live on forever.